A young girl, barely 12, who dreams of cooking but can't afford school, spends her days caring for her little sister and finds joy in a dusty old recipe book. One day she starts sharing meals with a homeless man. What happens next will completely change both of their lives forever. From abandoned kitchens to life-changing secrets, this is a story of kindness, resilience, and how one act of generosity can ignite a future no one saw coming. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The morning light barely crept through the smudged, dust-coated window of a cramped kitchen in Detroit. 12-year-old Clara Whitfield stood on tiptoes, reaching for a can of beans on the highest shelf. Her fingers brushed against the cold tin as she steadied herself on the worn counter. The kitchen was small, its walls yellowed with age, and the faint aroma of something fried lingered in the air, a faint echo of meals long past. "Clara, I'm hungry," a soft voice called from the next room. Clara glanced toward the doorway where her 4-year-old sister, Lila, stood clutching a makeshift doll made of old fabric. Her round cheeks were streaked with dirt, and her wide, innocent eyes looked up at Clara with quiet trust. "Breakfast is almost ready, Lila," Clara said, managing a smile as she placed the can on the counter. She opened it with a rusty manual opener, the lid popping off with a dull clink. She scooped the contents into a small pot and placed it on the old stovetop. The gas burner flickered hesitantly before settling into a steady flame. As the beans warmed, Clara tore a piece of bread into smaller portions and carefully arranged them on a plate. It wasn't much, but she had learned to make every crumb count. Her father used to say, "A little kindness can fill an empty belly, Clara, just as it can fill an empty heart." She clung to those words now, long after he was gone. Clara's father had died 4 years ago in an industrial accident, leaving her mother, Helen, to shoulder the weight of their small family. Helen worked endless shifts at a local textile factory, her fingers blistered and her back bent, just to keep a roof over their heads. The responsibility of the household had fallen on Clara's slender shoulders. She wasn't bitter about it, at least not most days, but as she stirred the beans and glanced at the worn shoes on her feet, she couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to live a life free of worry. Lila giggled softly as she played with her doll, making it dance across the worn linoleum floor. Clara served their modest breakfast and sat across from her sister. "Do you think Mama will come home early tonight?" Lila asked, her voice tinged with hope. Clara hesitated. She didn't want to dim her sister's spirits. "Maybe," she said with a small smile. "You know how busy she is." Lila nodded solemnly, her little hands gripping her spoon. "I miss her." Clara reached across the table, gently squeezing her sister's hand. "I know, Lila. Me too." After breakfast, Clara cleaned the dishes with water barely warm enough to cut through the grease. Lila wandered back into the tiny living room, humming a tune Clara recognized as something their mother used to sing. Once the chores were done, Clara pulled out an old, tattered book from the corner shelf. Its cover was faded, the title barely legible, A Taste of Home, Recipes for the Soul. It had belonged to her grandmother, who had passed away long before Clara could remember. The pages were filled with recipes written in elegant cursive, accompanied by little notes about flavors, memories, and love. Clara traced the lines of a recipe for apple pie, her mind wandering to a world where she could create dishes that brought people together. She imagined herself in a bustling kitchen, her hands deftly moving between pots and pans, crafting meals that made people smile. But reality tugged her back. They didn't have apples. They didn't even have the flour or sugar to attempt such a dish. Instead, Clara closed the book and tucked it back onto the shelf. Her dreams would have to wait. As the day stretched on, the sounds of the neighborhood filled the air, the shouts of children playing in the street, the distant hum of cars passing by, and the occasional bark of a dog. Clara glanced out the window, watching as the world seemed to move forward without her. She wished she could go to school, like the other kids her age, but that was a luxury her family couldn't afford. Instead, she spent her days caring for Lila, keeping the house in order, and trying to stretch their meager resources. The weight of it all pressed heavily on her, but she carried it with quiet determination. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Clara stood in the doorway of their small home, her arms crossed against the evening breeze. She watched Lila chase a butterfly in the front yard, her laughter light and carefree. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to feel a sliver of peace. But the gnawing question remained. How much longer could they hold on like this? The wind was brisk that afternoon as Clara ventured out to collect kindling for their stove. She clutched a worn basket, its handle frayed but sturdy enough for her small hands. Lila had fallen asleep after lunch, her tiny body curled beneath a patched quilt, giving Clara a rare moment to step outside. The park was just a few blocks away, a modest square of overgrown grass and rusting playground equipment. Clara rarely came here unless she needed firewood, as most of the neighborhood children didn't include her in their games. She didn't mind. There was always too much to do at home. As she approached the edge of the park, something caught her eye, a figure sitting hunched on a weathered bench beneath a skeletal oak tree. It was a man, his frame thin and cloaked in an oversized coat that had seen better days. His head was bowed, shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the world rested squarely on him. Clara slowed her steps, her curiosity piqued. She had seen plenty of people struggling in their neighborhood, but there was something different about him. He didn't look like he belonged here, yet here he was, as much a part of the park's worn landscape as the cracked sidewalks. The man seemed to sense her gaze and slowly lifted his head. His face was pale and gaunt, with a thick beard flecked with gray. His eyes, though tired, held a piercing sharpness. For a moment, Clara thought about turning away, but something in his expression stopped her. She continued gathering sticks, but her mind kept drifting back to the man. As her basket filled, her thoughts turned to the half loaf of bread and leftover soup she had tucked away at home. The idea came almost instinctively. She couldn't explain why, but she felt compelled to do something. Later that afternoon, after Lila had woken up and settled with her doll, Clara ladled some soup into a small container and wrapped a slice of bread in cloth. She hesitated briefly at the door, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. "Be careful who you trust, Clara. Not everyone is kind." Still, she stepped outside. Her heart thudded as she approached the park again, her small frame bracing against the chilly wind. The man was still there, sitting in the same hunched position, as if he hadn't moved since earlier. Clara cleared her throat softly as she neared the bench. "Excuse me, sir?" she said, her voice tentative but steady. The man looked up, his sharp eyes softening slightly as they met hers. "Yes?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "I, thought you might like this." She held out the cloth bundle in the container, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, he simply stared at her, as if trying to decipher her motives. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the offering. "Thank you," he said, his tone measured but sincere. He unwrapped the bread and broke off a piece, eating it with deliberate slowness. Not many people would bother. Clara shifted on her feet, unsure of how to respond. "It's just soup," she said, shrugging. The man's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "It's more than that," he replied. "It's kindness." Clara stayed a few moments longer, watching as he finished the meal. She noticed how he savored each bite, as though it was more than just food. It was something that brought him back to life, if only briefly. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Clara," she answered. "What's yours?" He paused before replying. "You can call me Everett," he said, his gaze shifting to the ground. "Okay, Mr. Everett," Clara said, unsure of what else to say. She started to turn away but stopped. "I'll bring more tomorrow if you're hungry." Everett looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded. "I'd like that." The next day, Clara returned with more soup and bread. This time, Mr. Everett seemed more at ease, even offering a quiet good afternoon as she approached. They spoke briefly about the weather, about how the park used to have more trees before most were cut down, but as the conversation shifted, Clara found herself surprised. "You're good with soup," he remarked after a spoonful. "Did you use thyme in this?" Clara blinked, startled. "Yes. How did you know?" His smile widened slightly. "You have a knack for flavor, kid. Not everyone does." She couldn't help but feel a spark of pride at his words. "I like cooking," she admitted. "I read recipe books a lot." Everett nodded thoughtfully. "Reading is one thing. Feeling the food, that's another. It's not just about following steps. It's about understanding what each ingredient can do." Clara tilted her head, intrigued. "Do you cook, Mr. Everett?" He chuckled softly, but it was a sound tinged with sadness. "I used to," he said vaguely, his gaze distant. Over the next few weeks, Clara and Mr. Everett settled into an unspoken rhythm. Every afternoon, Clara would bring him something to eat, leftover soup, a sandwich, or whatever she could scrape together. In return, Everett shared stories of dishes she'd never heard of, and cooking tips that sounded as though they came from the pages of her grandmother's recipe book. One chilly afternoon, Clara arrived at the park with a bowl of vegetable stew, steaming under a lid she had tied tightly with a dish towel. Everett was waiting on the same weathered bench, his coat wrapped tightly around him. "Afternoon, Clara," he greeted her with a faint smile. "Afternoon, Mr. Everett," Clara replied, as she handed him the bowl. She perched herself on the bench beside him, her legs swinging as she watched him eat. "This is good," Everett said after a few spoonfuls. "Let me guess. Bay leaves in the broth?" Clara nodded, pleased. "I read about it in one of my books. It said bay leaves add depth to soups." "Smart," Everett said, nodding approvingly. "Depth is what makes a dish memorable. Most people don't think about it. They just throw things in a pot and hope for the best." Clara giggled. "Is that what you do?" Everett chuckled softly. "Not quite. Cooking is like telling a story. Every ingredient has a role to play, and when you put them together just right, they create something people won't forget." Clara tilted her head, intrigued. "Did someone teach you that?" Everett hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the bare branches above them. "You could say that," he replied cryptically, before turning his attention back to her. "What about you? Why do you like cooking?" Clara thought for a moment, her small hands clutching the edges of the bench. "I guess it makes me happy. And when I cook something good, it makes other people happy too, like Lila. She always laughs when I bake bread because the smell tickles her nose." Everett smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "That's a good reason, Clara. Maybe the best reason." He paused, his expression thoughtful as he set the empty bowl aside. "You know," he said, leaning slightly forward, "I've got an idea. Why don't you try making herbed flatbread? It's simple but special. A little rosemary, some olive oil, nothing fancy, but it'll make your kitchen smell like a dream." Clara's eyes lit up. "I've never made bread like that before. How do I do it?" Everett grinned, his tone turning instructional. "Start with flour, water, and a pinch of salt. Mix it until it feels like soft clay. Add just a hint of rosemary. Don't go overboard, or it'll overpower the flavor. Roll it thin, brush it with olive oil, and bake it until it's golden. Not brown, golden. Got it?" Clara nodded eagerly, her mind already picturing the process. "I'll try it tonight." "Good," Everett said, his grin softening into something more thoughtful. "Bring me a piece when it's done. I'd like to see what you come up with." Clara felt a surge of excitement. "I will, Mr. Everett, I promise." As she stood to leave, Everett added, almost as an afterthought, "Cooking's not about perfection, Clara. It's about the care you put into it. That's what makes it unforgettable." Clara carried those words with her all the way home, her heart brimming with determination to make the best flatbread she could. That evening, after Lila had fallen asleep and the dishes were washed, Clara set to work. She measured the flour carefully, mixed in the herbs with delicate fingers, and kneaded the dough until it was soft and pliable. The kitchen filled with the fragrant aroma of rosemary and thyme as the bread baked, making her heart swell with anticipation. When it was done, Clara pulled the tray from the oven, marveling at the golden crust and the way the herbs seemed to shimmer in the light. She couldn't resist breaking off a small piece to taste. The flavors were bold yet balanced, each bite more satisfying than the last. The next day, Clara brought the flatbread to Everett, her hands trembling with both pride and nervousness. "Well?" she asked as he took a bite. Everett closed his eyes briefly, savoring the flavors. "Perfect," he said with a nod. "You've got the touch, kid." Clara beamed, her cheeks flushing with pride. "Really?" "Really," Everett said, his tone serious. "Most people can follow a recipe, but not everyone can make it their own. You did." Their friendship deepened with each passing day. Clara began to look forward to her afternoons with Everett, not just for the cooking tips, but for the stories he told. Stories of bustling kitchens, grand feasts, and dishes that could transport people to another time and place. Have you ever made something so good that someone cried? Clara asked one afternoon, her curiosity bubbling over. Everett chuckled. Once or twice, he admitted. Food has a way of connecting with people. Sometimes it reminds them of something they've lost, or it gives them something they didn't know they needed. Clara frowned thoughtfully. Like a hug, but for your stomach? Everett laughed, a sound that was becoming less rare these days. Exactly. But not everyone was thrilled with Clara's new routine. One evening, as Helen returned home from a grueling shift at the textile factory, she noticed the small containers and dish towels missing from their usual place in the cupboard. The kitchen felt emptier than it should have. "Clara!" Helen called out, her voice carrying both exhaustion and a hint of suspicion. Clara, who had been sitting at the table reading one of her grandmother's recipe books, looked up with a start. "Yes, Mom?" Helen set her bag down on the counter, her tired eyes scanning the kitchen. "What happened to the containers? And the towels?" Clara hesitated, her heart thudding in her chest. I used them," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen crossed her arms, her tone firm but laced with concern. "Use them for what?" Clara swallowed hard, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the book. "I've been sharing some food," she confessed, "with someone who needs it more than we do." Helen's brow furrowed as she stepped closer, her voice sharper now. "What do you mean, sharing? With who, Clara?" Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Mr. Everett," she said quietly. "He's homeless, Mom. He stays at the park near the edge of town." Helen's expression darkened, her worry quickly outweighing her fatigue. "Clara, you've been giving food to a stranger? A homeless man? Do you even know anything about him?" Clara straightened slightly, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "I know he's kind, Mom, and he's smart. He knows so much about food. He's been teaching me things I'd never learned from a book." Helen shook her head, her hand running through her hair in frustration. "Clara, you can't just trust someone because they seem nice. You don't know his past, what he's capable of. What if he's dangerous?" "He's not dangerous!" Clara's voice rose slightly, her cheeks flushing with indignation. "He's just a man who's had a hard life, and all I've done is share a little food with him. That's not wrong." Helen sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her daughter's words. "It's not about whether it's wrong, Clara. It's about keeping you safe. You're only 12. I can't lose you." The raw emotion in Helen's voice softened Clara's defensiveness. "I'm careful, Mom," she said quietly. "I promise I am. And Mr. Everett, he's not like that. He's different." Helen stared at her for a long moment, her worry etched in every line of her face. "Promise me," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Promise me you won't put yourself in danger." "I promise," Clara replied, her voice soft but resolute. Helen rubbed her temples, nodding slowly. "Okay, just be careful. And don't let this man take advantage of your kindness." "I won't," Clara said, her gaze steady. I want to help him, Mom. That's all." Helen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned toward the sink, her hands trembling slightly as she poured herself a glass of water. Clara watched her mother silently, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over them both like a heavy blanket. "Kindness is important, Clara," Helen said at last, her voice soft and weary. "But the world isn't always kind back. Just remember that." Clara nodded, though deep down she believed that kindness could still make a difference, even if the world didn't always return it. The first frost of the season painted the park in a delicate white sheen. Clara wrapped her thin scarf tightly around her neck as she hurried toward the familiar bench where Everett sat every afternoon. Today she carried a small package of cookies, an experimental recipe she had tried using molasses and cinnamon. When she reached the bench, Everett was already there, his posture as slouched as ever, but his hands busy flipping through the pages of a small leather-bound notebook. Clara had never seen him with anything other than the threadbare coat he always wore, and the sight of the notebook piqued her curiosity. "What's that?" she asked, tilting her head as she handed him the package. Everett hesitated, then slid the notebook into his coat pocket. "Just some old scribbles," he said lightly. "Looks important," Clara pressed, her voice careful. Everett chuckled softly. It is to me, he admitted, taking one of the cookies and biting into it. His eyes widened slightly. These are good. You're getting better, Clara. Clara smiled at the praise, but her curiosity lingered. She didn't ask more about the notebook, sensing it was something he wasn't ready to share. Over the following days, Clara noticed small changes in Everett's demeanor. While he still spoke with warmth and shared cooking tips, there were moments when his gaze would drift, as though he was lost in a memory. One afternoon, she found him staring at the playground across the park, his face shadowed by an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Did you have kids?" she blurted out before she could stop herself. Everett flinched, his hand tightening around the edge of the bench. He didn't answer immediately, and Clara worried she had overstepped. "I did," he said finally, his voice quiet. "A long time ago." "What happened?" Clara asked, her tone gentle. Everett shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Life happened." "Let's leave it at that, okay?" Clara nodded, though her curiosity burned brighter than ever. One cold afternoon, while Everett was distracted, Clara noticed the corner of the leather-bound notebook peeking out from his pocket. Before she could think better of it, she asked, "Can I see it?" Everett froze, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, she thought he would refuse, but then he sighed and handed it to her. Clara opened the notebook gingerly. Inside were pages filled with recipes written in elegant, precise handwriting. Notes in the margins described adjustments to flavors, plating techniques, and even suggestions for wine pairings. It was far too detailed and professional to belong to someone who had spent years living on the streets. Her fingers paused on a page with a title that stood out: Signature Seared Salmon with Lemon Thyme Reduction. Next to it was a faded photograph tucked into the fold of the page. It showed Everett in a pristine chef's coat, standing in front of a gleaming kitchen with a group of other chefs. Clara's mouth fell open. "You were a chef?" Everett sighed, leaning back on the bench. "Once upon a time," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara asked, her voice filled with awe. "Because it doesn't matter anymore," Everett replied, his gaze fixed on the ground. "That life is gone." "But," Clara hesitated, glancing back at the photograph, "you were amazing. I can tell just by looking at this." Everett let out a dry laugh. Amazing or not, it didn't stop everything from falling apart. As they sat in silence, Everett finally began to open up. He told Clara about his life before he came to the park, a life filled with bustling kitchens, accolades, and the pursuit of culinary perfection. He had owned a successful chain of restaurants and had been hailed as one of the best chefs in the region. But one fateful night, a fire had engulfed his home while his family slept. Everett had been at one of his restaurants, overseeing the dinner rush. By the time he arrived at the scene, it was too late. His wife and son were gone. The weight of his grief consumed him. He abandoned his career, sold his restaurants, and disappeared from the culinary world. For years, he drifted, unable to reconcile the life he had lost with the one he was left with. Clara listened intently, her heart aching for him. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Everett," she said softly. He nodded, his jaw tight. "That's why I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see me as anything other than the man sitting on this bench." "But you're more than that," Clara insisted. "You still have so much to share." Everett looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but it's hard to see the point sometimes." Clara placed the notebook gently back in his hands. "You gave me this," she said, "and it's already changed the way I think about cooking. That has to mean something." That evening, as Clara returned home, her mind was spinning with everything Everett had told her. She couldn't imagine carrying the kind of pain he did, but she admired his strength. Despite everything, he had chosen to share a piece of himself with her, and she felt determined to honor that. She pulled out her grandmother's recipe book and added a note in the margins of one page. "Every dish tells a story. Make it one worth sharing." The following week brought a sense of renewal to Clara. After hearing Everett's story, she found herself inspired, not just to cook, but to pour her heart into every dish she made. It wasn't about following recipes anymore. It was about creating something meaningful. "Are you ready to learn?" Everett asked one brisk morning as Clara arrived at the park, carrying a small loaf of bread she had baked the night before. Clara nodded enthusiastically. Always, Everett gestured for her to sit beside him. We'll start with the basics. Cooking is about precision, yes, but it's also about intuition. You need to learn how to trust your instincts. Clara listened intently as Everett described techniques she had never considered before. How to balance flavors, how to build layers of taste, and how to respect every ingredient for what it could offer. Take this bread, Everett said, breaking off a piece. You did a good job with the texture, but it's missing something. Clara frowned, puzzled. What is it missing? He smiled knowingly. Salt. Just a pinch would have brought out the flavor in the flour. Sometimes, it's the smallest things that make the biggest difference. Over the next few days, Everett guided Clara through various techniques. He taught her how to julienne vegetables, how to caramelize onions without burning them, and even how to make a basic roux for sauces. One day, as Clara carefully practiced chopping a carrot with a knife Everett had lent her, he leaned back on the bench, watching her with a satisfied expression. You've got talent, kid, he said, but talent isn't enough. You need passion and discipline. Clara looked up, her brow furrowed. How do you know if you have enough passion? Everett chuckled. Passion isn't measured, Clara. It's felt. If you wake up thinking about cooking, if you fall asleep dreaming about it, then you have it. Clara thought about the nights she spent poring over her grandmother's recipe book, imagining herself creating dishes that brought joy to others. I think I have it, she said quietly. Everett nodded. Good. Then let's keep going. One afternoon, Everett handed Clara a folded piece of paper. This, he said, is a recipe I created years ago. It's called lemon herb risotto. I want you to try it. Clara unfolded the paper carefully, her eyes scanning the instructions. The ingredients were simple, but the process was detailed. It's not easy, Everett warned. Risotto requires patience. You have to stir constantly, add the broth little by little, and pay attention to the texture. If you rush it, you'll ruin it. Clara nodded determinedly. I'll do my best. That evening, Clara set to work in her tiny kitchen. Lila watched curiously from the table, her chin resting on her hands. What are you making? Lila asked. Something special, Clara replied, her focus unwavering as she stirred the rice in the pan. The kitchen filled with the aroma of lemon and fresh herbs, and Clara felt a thrill of excitement. She tasted the risotto, adjusting the seasoning carefully until it was just right. When it was done, she served a small portion for Lila and herself. This is amazing, Lila exclaimed after her first bite. You should make this all the time, Clara laughed, her heart swelling with pride. Maybe one day I will. The next day, Clara brought a small container of the risotto to Everett. He tasted it with the scrutiny of a seasoned chef, his expression thoughtful. Well? Clara asked anxiously. Everett set the container down and looked at her with a rare smile. You nailed it, kid. This is perfect. Clara beamed, feeling as though she had just won a prize. Really? Really, Everett said firmly. You've got what it takes. Don't ever doubt that. As their lessons continued, Clara began to notice changes at home. Her mother, Helen, seemed less tense when she saw Clara cooking. Lila, who once asked endless questions, now watched quietly, soaking in every move her sister made. One evening, Helen sat at the kitchen table, watching Clara prepare dinner. You've been spending a lot of time with Mr. Everett, she remarked. Clara paused, glancing over her shoulder. He's teaching me how to cook, she said simply. Helen frowned slightly. You've always been good at cooking, Clara. Why do you need him? Clara set down the spoon she was holding and turned to face her mother. Because he believes in me, Mom, and he's teaching me things I never thought I could do. Helen's expression softened, though her eyes still held a trace of worry. I just don't want you to get hurt, Clara. People can be complicated. Clara nodded, understanding her mother's caution. But deep down, she knew Everett wasn't like that. He had opened up a world to her that she hadn't even dared to dream about before. One night, as Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought about everything Everett had taught her. She realized that cooking wasn't just about feeding people, it was about connection. Every dish she made was a piece of herself, a way of sharing her heart with others. And for the first time in her young life, she felt like she had found her purpose. The first signs of winter crept into the air, carrying a sharp chill that seeped through the cracks of Clara's small home. The heating barely worked, and Helen's long shifts at the textile factory only seemed to grow longer. Clara did her best to keep the house warm and inviting, but the weight of their struggles pressed down harder with each passing day. One evening, as Helen arrived home, her face was lined with an exhaustion deeper than usual. Clara was stirring a pot of stew on the stove, while Lila hummed softly, coloring at the kitchen table. Helen dropped a stack of envelopes onto the counter, her hands trembling slightly. "What's wrong, Mom?" Clara asked, turning from the stove. Helen sighed, rubbing her temples. "The landlord raised the rent. He says we have until the end of the month to pay or we'll have to leave." The room fell silent. Even Lila looked up from her coloring, her wide eyes filled with confusion. "What does that mean, Mommy?" Lila asked innocently. Helen forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Lila's face. "It just means we'll have to work a little harder, sweetheart. Don't you worry about it." But Clara could see the truth in her mother's eyes. They were barely making ends meet as it was. A rent increase was more than they could handle. That night, as Helen and Lila slept, Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. The thought of leaving their home, the only place that still felt like a sanctuary, made her chest tighten. The next morning, Clara brought a small container of soup to Everett, her face pale with worry. He noticed immediately. "What's wrong, kid?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. Clara hesitated, then blurted out everything. The rent increase, her mother's exhaustion, the looming threat of eviction. Everett listened silently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back on the bench, his gaze thoughtful. "It's tough," he said finally. "But tough times don't last. Tough people do." Clara frowned, frustration bubbling to the surface. "What does that even mean? We're trying our best, but it's never enough." Everett leaned forward, his sharp eyes meeting hers. "It means you don't give up, Clara. You fight, and sometimes you have to get creative." The next day, Everett called Clara to a quiet corner of the park where he often sat. This time, he carried a small duffel bag, a rare sight for the usually empty-handed man. "Come with me," he said simply. Clara followed him down a series of back alleys until they arrived at an abandoned building. The paint was peeling and the windows were boarded up, but Everett's steps were purposeful as he led her inside. The air inside was cold and stale, but Clara's eyes widened as she took in the scene. In the corner of the room was a makeshift kitchen, an old stove, a counter covered in cooking utensils, and a few shelves lined with jars of spices. "This is my kitchen," Everett said with a faint smile, "or what's left of it." Clara ran her fingers over the counter, marveling at the collection of tools and ingredients. "You kept all this?" "Most of it," Everett said. "After the fire, I didn't have much left. But I couldn't let this go. It's all I have of my old life." Clara turned to him, her eyes filled with curiosity. "Why are you showing me this?" Everett stepped closer, his expression serious. "Because I believe in you, Clara. I see what you're capable of, and I want to help. If we're going to fight, we need to use what we have, and this is what I have." Over the next few days, Clara and Everett began planning. They decided to organize a small feast for the neighborhood, a way to showcase Clara's growing skills while also creating a sense of community. Everett believed that if people saw what Clara could do, it might open doors for her, and perhaps even provide the support her family desperately needed. Clara threw herself into the preparations, practicing recipes late into the night. Everett guided her every step of the way, pushing her to refine her techniques and think creatively about how to use the limited ingredients they had. As the day of the feast approached, Clara grew more nervous. "What if no one comes?" she asked Everett one afternoon as they prepared a batch of rolls. "They'll come," Everett said confidently. "People are drawn to good food, and even more to good people. Trust me." Clara nodded, though the butterflies in her stomach remained. On the morning of the feast, the abandoned building buzzed with quiet energy. Clara and Everett worked side by side, transforming the makeshift kitchen into a space filled with warmth and the aroma of roasting vegetables, freshly baked bread, and simmering sauces. Neighbors began to trickle in, drawn by the smells and the curiosity of something new in their otherwise quiet lives. Clara greeted them with a shy smile, offering samples of her dishes. To her amazement, the reactions were overwhelmingly positive. People marveled at the flavors, praising her skills and asking how she had learned to cook so well. "Wow," a young boy whispered, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "It looks like a real restaurant." Clara's cheeks flushed, but she managed a shy smile as she stepped forward. "Welcome, everyone. Please help yourselves." At first, the crowd moved hesitantly, as if they couldn't believe this feast was meant for them. But as the first bites were taken, the room came alive with murmurs of approval. "This is delicious," an older woman exclaimed, holding up a slice of bread slathered with butter. "I haven't had risotto like this in years," another man added, his tone filled with wonder. Clara's heart swelled with pride as she watched the scene unfold. People who rarely spoke to one another were now laughing and sharing stories over plates of food. Children darted between tables, sneaking extra rolls, while adults marveled at the flavors. Everett stood at the back of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. His usual stoic expression softened as he observed Clara in her element. She moved with a natural grace, answering questions about the dishes and encouraging shy guests to try something new. "You've done something special here, kid," he said quietly as Clara approached him with a plate. "It's not just me," Clara replied, offering him a roll. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Everett accepted the roll but shook his head. "You had it in you all along. I just gave you a push." As the night wore on, Clara found herself at the center of a group of children, teaching them how to knead dough for bread. Lila was among them, her tiny hands coated in flour as she giggled with delight. "This is fun," one of the boys said, his eyes lighting up as Clara showed him how to shape the dough. "It's more than fun," Clara said, her voice filled with conviction. "Cooking is a way to bring people together. It's how we show love, even when words aren't enough." Her words hung in the air, resonating with the adults who overheard her. A few exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. As the feast wound down and the last plates were cleared, a man in a neatly pressed jacket approached Clara. He had been watching quietly from the corner for most of the evening. "Excuse me," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Robert Lewis. I run the community center a few blocks over. This was incredible. Did you make all of this?" Clara hesitated, glancing at Everett, who gave her a subtle nod. "Yes, sir," she replied, "with some help from my mentor." Robert smiled warmly. "You have a real gift, young lady. We could use someone like you at the center. We're always looking for ways to teach life skills to the kids in the neighborhood. And cooking, well, that's a skill everyone can use." Clara's eyes widened. "You mean you want me to teach?" "Why not?" Robert said. "You've already proven you can inspire people. Think about it." After the guests had gone and the kitchen was quiet once more, Clara and Everett sat at the long table, sharing a plate of leftover chicken. The room still carried the warmth of the evening, and Clara felt an unfamiliar but welcome sense of accomplishment. "What did I tell you?" Everett said, breaking the silence. Clara smiled, resting her chin on her hands. "You were right. People came, and they loved it." Everett nodded, his gaze distant but content. "You've got something special, Clara, and tonight you shared it with the world. That's what it's all about." Clara looked down at her hands, which still carried the faint scent of rosemary and thyme. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Everett leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. Now we see where this takes you. And trust me, it's going to be somewhere good." The days following the grand feast felt like a whirlwind for Clara. Everywhere she went, neighbors stopped her to compliment her cooking or share stories about the joy the food had brought to their families. For the first time in what felt like forever, she began to feel like she belonged, not just in her home, but in her community. Jasper, however, seemed quieter than usual. He still met Clara at the park, still guided her through recipes and techniques, but his once sharp demeanor carried an air of finality, as though he were preparing for something. One brisk afternoon, Clara arrived at the park with a small package of her latest creation, spiced apple tarts, baked using the last of the apples she had managed to save. She found Jasper sitting on his usual bench, his coat pulled tightly around him, gazing at the playground across the park. "Mr. Everett," she called softly, setting the tarts down beside him. He turned to her with a faint smile. "Afternoon, kid. What have you got for me today?" "Apple tarts," Clara replied, sitting down beside him. "They're still warm." Jasper took one and bit into it, his eyes closing briefly as he savored the flavors. "Perfect balance," he said. "Sweet, with just the right hint of spice. You're getting better every day, Clara." Clara smiled, but her brow furrowed as she studied him. "Are you okay? You've seemed different lately." Jasper hesitated, then let out a quiet sigh. "Just a lot on my mind," he admitted. "But I'm fine, Clara. Don't you worry about me." Over the next few days, Jasper began teaching Clara more than just cooking. He showed her how to plan menus, how to calculate costs, and how to manage inventory. Clara noticed that his lessons felt more urgent, as though he were trying to prepare her for something bigger. "Why are you teaching me all this now?" Clara asked one evening as they reviewed a recipe for sourdough bread. "Because you're ready," Jasper said simply. Clara frowned. "Ready for what?" Jasper's gaze softened. "For whatever comes next." One morning, Jasper called Clara to the abandoned building where they had hosted the feast. The kitchen was as they had left it, with pots and pans neatly stacked on the counters and spices lined up in jars. Jasper motioned for Clara to sit at the table, then placed a small, thick envelope in front of her. "What's this?" Clara asked, her fingers hesitating over the envelope. "Open it," Jasper said gently. Inside was a letter, along with several documents. Clara's eyes widened as she read the contents. The letter explained that Jasper had prepared a formal will, leaving Clara not only his recipes and tools, but also a substantial financial inheritance, enough to change her life and secure her future. "I don't understand," Clara said, her voice trembling. "This is a lot of money." Jasper nodded. "I've been holding on to it for years, not knowing what to do with it. But now I know. It's for you, Clara." Clara's heart raced as she tried to process his words. "Why? Why would you give this to me?" "Because I believe in you," Jasper said, his tone steady. "And because I want to make sure you have the chance to become everything you're meant to be. This money, it's just a tool. What you do with it, that's what matters." Clara stared at the documents, her mind spinning. She thought about her mother, about Lila, about all the struggles they had faced. This money could change everything for them. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Jasper smiled faintly. "You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you'll use it wisely. And keep cooking, Clara. The world needs what you have to offer." That evening, Clara returned home with the envelope clutched tightly in her hands. She found Helen in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner, while Lila played with her doll at the table. "Mom," Clara said, her voice shaking. Helen turned, her brow furrowing in concern. "What's wrong, Clara?" Clara handed her the letter. Helen read it silently, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to disbelief. "This can't be real," Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is," Clara said. "Mr. Everett gave it to me. He said it's for us, for me to use to follow my dreams." Helen sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she held the letter. "I don't understand. Why would he do this?" "Because he believes in me," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "And because he knows what it's like to lose everything. He wants to help us, Mom." Helen looked at her daughter, her eyes brimming with tears. "Clara, this could change everything." Clara nodded, her resolve strengthening. "It will. I'll make sure of it." The first snow of winter dusted the streets, settling softly over the rooftops and bare trees. Clara sat at the kitchen table, gazing at the letter Jasper had written her weeks before. Though his inheritance could secure her family's future, the weight of his gesture felt too great to handle alone. Her thoughts were interrupted by Helen, who entered the kitchen, drying her hands with a dishcloth. "What are you thinking, Clara?" she asked, her voice gentle. Clara looked up, determination gleaming in her eyes. "I want to help him, Mom. He's done so much for us, and he shouldn't be alone anymore." The next morning, Clara approached Jasper at the park, clutching a warm scarf she had knitted with scraps of yarn. She wrapped it around his neck before he could protest. "What's this about, kid?" Jasper asked, raising an eyebrow. "You're moving in with us?" Clara declared, crossing her arms. "You've given us so much already, and it's time we do the same for you." Jasper hesitated, his gruff exterior cracking for a moment. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Clara said firmly. "You're family." Within days, Jasper became a part of the Whitfield household. Though the adjustment was awkward at first, Jasper wasn't used to being around a bustling family, and Helen wasn't sure how to navigate his quiet presence. It didn't take long for him to settle in. Lila adored him, frequently dragging him into her world of dolls and imaginary tea parties. Helen, initially guarded, found herself appreciating his advice on everything from managing a budget to repairing their rickety dining chairs. And Clara, for the first time, felt like she had a team behind her. One cold afternoon, Jasper led Clara to the abandoned building where he had once kept his makeshift kitchen. Together, they stood in the empty space, envisioning what it could become. "It's not much," Jasper admitted, his voice tinged with doubt. "It's enough," Clara said, her eyes shining. "We can turn this into something special." With Helen's help, they set to work transforming the space into a small, welcoming eatery. The walls were scrubbed and repainted, the counters repaired, and the shelves restocked. Jasper brought out his treasured tools and spices, while Clara contributed her boundless energy and growing culinary skills. Neighbors pitched in, just as they had with the feast. Some donated old furniture, others helped install lights and fix the leaky roof. Slowly but surely, the abandoned kitchen transformed into a cozy little restaurant. Jasper spent every day teaching Clara everything he knew, not just about cooking, but about the philosophy behind it. "Cooking isn't just about making something taste good," he told her one evening as they prepped ingredients for the opening. "It's about telling a story, connecting with people. If you cook with love, people will feel it in every bite." Clara hung on his every word, her passion growing with each lesson. She practiced tirelessly, often staying late into the night to perfect her recipes. Helen would watch from the doorway, a mix of pride and amazement on her face. "You're becoming quite the chef, Clara," Helen said one evening as Clara plated a dish with precision. Clara smiled, glancing at Jasper. "It's because I have the best teacher." 10 years later. The bustling sound of clinking glasses and quiet chatter filled the elegant dining hall of a renowned restaurant. Clara Whitfield stood near the entrance, dressed in a crisp chef's coat, her name embroidered on the chest. She had just finished an interview for a major culinary magazine, recounting the journey that had brought her to this moment. "What inspires your cooking?" the reporter had asked. Clara's response had been immediate, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Everything I do is because of Jasper Everett. He saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself. He taught me not just how to cook, but how to believe in myself." As she reflected on her words, Clara walked to the corner of the room where a framed photograph hung on the wall. It was an image of her and Jasper standing outside the small restaurant they had built together, Everett's Table, the sign above their heads glowing softly. Jasper had passed away 3 years earlier, quietly and peacefully in his sleep, but his presence was still deeply felt. His lessons, his stories, and his unwavering belief in Clara had shaped every decision she made. Clara walked into the kitchen, where her sous chefs were busy preparing the evening service. She watched for a moment, a small smile tugging at her lips as they worked with the precision and passion Jasper had instilled in her. "Chef Whitfield," one of the young cooks called, holding up a plate. "Can you check this?" Clara stepped forward, examining the dish with a critical but encouraging eye. "It's perfect," she said. "Send it out." As she turned back to her station, she paused, running her fingers over the edge of her chef's knife. It was Jasper's, the same knife he had used to teach her how to julienne carrots all those years ago. "You were right, Jasper," she murmured softly, her voice carrying only to herself. "Cooking really is about telling a story, and ours is just beginning."